Today's webinar is Windsor Locks Goes TIF, a real-life tax increment financing case study. In 2015, Connecticut Main Street Center, in partnership with the Connecticut chapter of the American Planning Association and the Connecticut Economic Development Association, and with the assistance from Pullman Comley LLC and the Yale Law School's Community and Economic Development Clinic, proposed new tax increment financing legislation during the regular legislative session to benefit a wider variety of projects consistent with the state's policies for responsible growth. The bill passed unanimously, and Public Act 15-57 was signed into law by Governor Malloy. Today, we will discover how Windsor Locks became the first municipality in the state to enact a TIF district under this new law. We are grateful to the sponsors of today's webinar. Pullman Comley LLC is our TIF webinar sponsor, and the Connecticut chapter of the American Planning Association is a co-sponsor. A note to certified planners: you will receive 1 CM credit for attending today's webinar. Please be sure to complete the brief evaluation at the conclusion of this presentation. We thank the sponsors of our Main Street Forums for the 21st century, and also Connecticut Main Street Center sponsors. Our founding sponsors are Eversource and the Connecticut Department of Economic and Community Development, and our growth partners are UIL Holdings Corporation and the Connecticut State Historic Preservation Office. Our presenters today, I'm pleased to introduce Michael Andreana, attorney with Pullman Comley LLC and a board member of Connecticut Main Street Center. Mike drafted the language for the expanded tax increment financing mechanism and was an integral part of the legislation's successful passage during the 2015 legislative session. And Patrick McMahon, Director of Economic Development for the Town of Suffield. Patrick previously served as part-time economic development consultant for the Town of Windsor Locks, where he facilitated the completion of a Main Street Master Plan for the community. We are also joined today by Connecticut Main Street Center staff, Christine Schilke, our Director of Communications, and Judith Stahl.
Thank you, Kim, and thank you all for spending time with us this morning. Before we get started with our presentations, I'd just like to ask this question at the beginning of all of our webinars: what is your current role in your town's Main Street? If you could all take a moment and just click in and answer, it gives us an idea of who's in the room. If none of the 4 options really apply to you, you can click Other. If you do that, I'd appreciate if you would just type in a message in the chat box or the question box and let me know how you would term yourself. It gives us, like I said, just an idea of who's joining us this morning. And while you're all doing that, I'm going to handle just a few housekeeping items. If you or perhaps a colleague has any technical problems this morning, there's a link in your confirmation email to the GoToWebinar help page that may help you troubleshoot. Today's session will run approximately 1 hour, including time to answer your questions. We ask that if you have questions, you type them into your dashboard as we go. Christine will be monitoring those questions, and we will pause as needed for clarification, as well as at least once for a Q&A session. On your dashboard, you also have 5 handouts available for today's session. They can either be downloaded immediately this morning, or they will be on our website at ctmainstreet.org, hopefully by tomorrow. A recording of today's session and a PDF version of the presentation will also be available on the website, as are all Connecticut Main Street Center webinars. You can find them in the Education and Resources section under the Workshops Archives. And finally, at the end of today's session, you will receive a brief evaluation. We would greatly appreciate your input so that we can continue to improve these sessions. Now, it looks like we have a pretty good number of people who've answered my question, so I'm going to go ahead and close that out and show you who is on with you this morning. So we have pretty much a nice split between municipal employees and planners, and then a fair amount of you choosing Other. So again, I would really appreciate it if you would let me know how you would term yourself. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and hide that and turn things over to Mike Andreana.
Thank you, Judith. This is Mike Andreana from Pullman Comley. Good morning, everyone. I'm going to start today's session with a brief overview of the tax increment financing law, which went into effect in 2015. After that, then Patrick will probably dive into the case study of exactly what went on in Windsor Locks. First question, what is tax increment financing? Bottom line, tax increment financing is another economic development tool. It effectively uses or leverages new real property taxes that come about based on development to help finance that particular development project or another development project within a district. It's important to remember when we're talking about tax increment financing that these incremental revenues that we're going to use to help at development projects are based on increases in assessed value of properties within the district. It's not enough just to have a municipality's mill rate go up, but no change in the assessed value. The incremental revenues are only generated when the assessed value increases. Under the new legislation, and I believe this is very helpful, is that districts can be single parcel, very project specific districts, or they can be multi-parcel kind of downtown districts that could include hundreds of parcels if a municipality decides that's going to be the size of their tax increment financing district. Bottom line, at the end of the day, what we're trying to do with tax increment financing is encourage development in kind of underdeveloped or underutilized areas. It is the classic but-for test. The idea being that we're not going to use tax increment financing when a developer's willing to come in without assistance. It's only in those cases where the project doesn't work without the municipality stepping in some sort of fashion to help the development. Here we have some of the, this is probably from the municipal perspective, some of the advantages of tax increment financing. First one would be it's a means of the municipality putting some skin in the game in its economic development efforts. And the stark reality now is that for most municipalities, for major development projects, there is going to be some level of municipal assistance. Big projects just don't happen anymore without the municipality stepping in to at least some level. Obviously, we're doing this, or municipalities doing this, to attract investment in the municipality, to increase your tax base, your grand list, and probably ultimately to promote job growth within a municipality. And I think probably one of the important things that you can use tax increment financing for, especially in the case where you're talking about a particular development project and you might be entering into a credit enhancement agreement, which we will discuss a little more later, is you can kind of control some of the performance standards for that project. If you're a municipality and you're willing to put the money in, you can demand certain standards from the developer to get the type of project that's right for the municipality. Here's a little visual slide that kind of shows how tax increment financing works. If we start from the left-hand side, the fixed tax base in the law's parlance would be called the original assessed value. The mill rate times that fixed tax base, and that's the assessed value of the district at the time the district's created. Those tax revenues always go back to the municipality's general fund. Those are not the incremental revenues being shared or being used for development in the project. The incremental revenues are the blue area, where is the new taxes created by the increase in development and the increase in assessed value. And the other important thing to take from this slide is that all these districts have a set life. Under the law, the life of a district can go up to 50 years. On our example here, we have it at 23 years. But when the district kind of terminates pursuant to its own plan, all of the tax revenue within the district from all development will then kick back and go back to the municipality's general fund. I'm now going to talk a little bit about the kind of the mechanics of getting a TIF district approved under Public Act 1557. One of those is you have to prepare a master plan. And again, we'll talk about that in a little detail later on, but it's basically a written plan that kind of outlines what is the future plan for the district, what kind of development are you looking at, what is the state of the parcels within the district, those types of things. Once you have that plan, one of the requirements of the Act is that you need a written advisory opinion from your local planning agency that basically analyzes the plan and makes a determination that the plan is consistent with the municipality's plan of conservation and development. And that is required by the Act. The Act also requires that the municipality have at least one public hearing. My guess is for those municipalities where this is your first TIF district, you're very likely to have additional meetings, whether they're informational sessions for the public or for your elected officials that kind of explain the whole TIF process. But you are required to have a public hearing with notice in a newspaper and the ability for the public to comment. And the last step in approving a master plan would be that your local legislative body, and that could be a council in certain municipalities, it could be the town meeting in other municipalities, your local legislative body approves the master plan. Here we have kind of the primary components of the master plan. The plan itself has to have a legal description of the district boundaries. It typically would, in fact, it needs to list each of the parcels within the district along with its tax ID number. Most plans that I've worked on also include kind of the original assessed value of each parcel within the district. It has a general description of the condition of the properties within the district. It should have, again, a general description of the anticipated kind of public facilities and improvements that are going to go on within the district that are anticipated to be financed with TIF revenues. It has a financial plan component, which we'll talk about a little more. As I mentioned earlier, the district has a maximum term of 50 years. You can decide on a shorter term if you want to. Most districts that you see will have a typical life somewhere between 20 or 30 years. and that plan that creates the district has to be reviewed by the legislative body at least once every 10 years. One thing that you don't see on this slide but is important to know is that the plan can be amended at any time. It just needs to go through the same process that you went through when you approved the plan. That would be the opinion, the public hearing, and the local legislative body approval. Okay, here we talk about some of the financial plan components. We talked about the assessed values of the property within the district. You're talking about cost estimates, expected maximum amount of debt. When you're putting this plan together, because it has such a long life, you should just try to make the plan as flexible and as broad as possible. All of these types of requirements, what you need to put in here are your anticipated or expected, your expectations at the time of the plan. And these are important because you don't want the plan restricting you of doing certain things that you might like to do going forward. Some of the other things here are estimates of increased assessed value, and probably the most important thing is putting in there the maximum percentage of the incremental tax revenues that are generated from your district that can be used for the district. And under the new act, that can be anywhere from 0% to 100%. It's important to remember, if you're trying to promote a lot of this increased development, you're going to have additional demands placed on the municipality. So you're very likely to want a percentage of the increased taxes to go back to the municipal general fund. So you could put in a plan that 75% of the incremental tax revenues would be dedicated to the district, and the other 25% could flow to the general fund. Here I have kind of a long list of the types of costs that can be financed with TIF revenues. If you have a chance to look at the Act, it basically covers almost anything you could think of. It is much more than the old kind of TIF districts of just funding public infrastructure. You could have a revolving loan program. You could use TIF revenues to help a developer repay debt that it's incurred in connection with the development. You can use it to reimburse municipal costs related to the development, personnel costs, professional consultant costs, all different types of things. And then the last thing that I want to touch on is financing, using your incremental revenues to help finance certain projects. I think probably it's easier to look at, if I go to the next slide, is that there's really kind of 4 different uses for the incremental tax revenues. One would be to finance bonds of the municipality. They could be either revenue bonds or they could be GO bonds, but you might use these if the municipality has agreed to finance infrastructure within the district, and you could use those incremental tax revenues from the future development to repay these bonds. You could also use incremental tax revenues to help a developer refinance or pay for some of its debt. In other states where TIF districts are kind of more popular and have been used for a number of years, what's very common is for the municipality to enter into a credit enhancement agreement with a developer that basically tells the developer that they're willing to share a certain percentage of these incremental revenues, basically give them back to the developer each year, and the developer can take that credit enhancement agreement, bring it to a bank, and get a loan based on the stream of payments that the municipality has promised through the credit enhancement agreement. So that's kind of a unique and different use of TIF revenues than what we in Connecticut have seen in the past. You could also decide that you're not going to use any debt and you're just going to collect these incremental tax revenues on an annual basis, put them in a fund, and then as you accumulate this money, decide to spend it on future projects within the TIF district. We call this kind of your pay-as-you-go basis. Could be used for maybe streetscapes or something like that. And then finally, the TIF revenues, as I mentioned before, a portion of them could flow right to the general fund to help pay for these increased governmental services created by the project. That ends kind of my overview of the law. I guess.
So we do have a couple questions that are really good. One is, this is a little bit speculative, but understanding kind of what's being proposed in Washington, do you expect that there will be any impacts to TIF because of cuts to low-income housing tax credits or any other reduced funding?
I wouldn't see what's being at least discussed in Washington of having any kind of direct effect on TIF financing. I guess bottom line, if you look really big picture, sure, that might affect certain types of development projects that a developer would consider for your municipality. But as far as TIF itself, that is all based on local real property tax revenues, which I would bet are going to be around in Connecticut for a long time.
And then, do you think that TIFs are appropriate in all situations, like greenfield development, or are they better suited to existing brownfield type development?
They are definitely not suited for all types of development. Again, it is an economic development tool. It's something else that an economic development official would have in their toolbox. If we go back to when I started, I think it really should relate back to this kind of but-for test. So if you have a challenged parcel that just the costs are higher because maybe it's a brownfield, so you need additional funds for that, that's where TIF makes sense. If you have a nice flat vacant greenfield that any developer could go in and it's in a great location, then maybe TIF doesn't make sense there. Maybe one developer would ask for it, but maybe there's another developer that doesn't need it, and in that case the municipality would not have to commit any of its own funds.
And then I just have one more question for now before we get into Patrick, and maybe Patrick at the end of yours you can respond to this as well. But we do have a question about whether there needs to be a high level of trust for the TIF to work between the town and the developers, and if there's protections in case that relationship gets a little rocky.
Yes, there should be some trust. The municipality should be comfortable and confident with the developer. There are some mechanisms that the municipality can use to kind of provide some extra protection, especially when we get into the financing. Under this new law, even public infrastructure improvements, you can ask the developer to take on those costs, promise the developer that as long as they build what they say they're going to build and pay the taxes, you'll give a percentage of those new taxes back to them, and they can use that to pay down the infrastructure debt. That basically transfers the construction risks that a municipality might not want to take on and transfers it to the developer. So there are mechanisms that you could use to provide some extra protections, but I think at the end of the day, and Patrick can talk about this a little more, is each party needs to be comfortable with each other and feel like they have the right teammate that they're working with.
So I think what we'll do then is, Patrick, why don't you go ahead and give your presentation, and as I said, I know you kind of have a real life example of that, and maybe you can speak to that when we get to that slide. And I would just encourage everyone listening to go ahead and continue entering your questions. We will have future pauses for additional questions.
And before Patrick starts, I'm going to jump in one more time and ask you all another question to give us again an idea of where you all are and what you're coming to this presentation, where you're coming to this presentation from. And that is your community considering establishing a TIF district? And if you could just, if you are a municipal employee or leader, if you could go ahead and answer that question for us. If it doesn't make sense for you to answer it, feel free not to. I'm not going to take attendance. But that looks like, let's see, I'm going to give it just another minute for everybody to vote, and then go ahead and cut you off at this point. I'm going to close it, and you'll see that it's kind of 50-50. So that's good, and it'll be interesting to see, to hear the rest of this presentation, and hopefully you will all find it very interesting. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Patrick.
Thank you, Judith. Good morning, and thank you for joining us this morning. Most people know Windsor Locks because of it being the home to Bradley International Airport. You're probably familiar with the airport-related businesses along El Grasso Turnpike. However, in the community, despite having this state economic development engine, we have a main street that languished over a series of decades. The community identified really early on the potential that this new TIF legislation could bring to the community with the new tool to enhance our main street and try to revitalize it. And so our goal is to provide you some insights to what our approach was to the adoption of the district, and hopefully you'll pick up some tips based on lessons learned in Windsor Locks. As Judith said, there are a couple of handouts, one of which is our TIF Policy. Another is our Downtown Master Plan itself. We can provide those to you in a Word document format if you'd like to utilize any of the language that is in those documents. All right, so our Downtown TIF District, what were some of the issues that we were facing? Since the 60s and 70s, we had an urban renewal activity, which was happening throughout the whole nation. It decimated many main streets, including the one in Windsor Locks. As you can see from this photo, we had multi-story mixed-use buildings. There was restaurants, there was bars, there was retail, there was housing on the upper stories, on-street parking, walkable wide sidewalks, everything that most communities today would absolutely love to have. It all was demolished and replaced with auto-related strip centers like you see down in the bottom photo. Some other aspects of challenges in Windsor Locks is that it essentially is a one-sided main street. Lore has it that it was in the Guinness Book of World Records as that. And the reason being is there's a canal as well as and railroad tracks that are on one side of Main Street. So we had a series of vacant and underutilized buildings, and we needed to do something about it. Thankfully, just like all communities and all downtowns, you're going to have some assets to work with. Windsor Locks is no different. We have the Connecticut River. There's no direct, real public access to it, and so that's certainly something that we're trying to achieve. We've got this historic asset called the Windsor Locks Canal. It was completed in 1829. It's on the National Register of Historic Places. Irish laborers put it together, built it in order to bypass the Enfield Rapids so that trade could go up and down the river. It became obsolete very quickly because of rail. We have our government center. We've got a library, a middle school, town hall in the town center. We've got a beautiful park. It's actually the home ball field of the 1965 Little League World Series champions. It's a densely populated neighborhood because of the mills that formed on the river itself. A lot of single-family, multifamily, two-family residents on very small lots. So I think that's a really great benefit for Windsor Locks going forward, is to have that dense population right there. We have over 70 businesses, some restaurants, some retail, mostly service related. We have active industry. We have it's called the Alstrom Corporation, which is a successor of the Dexter Corporation. It's a Finnish company now, and they do products that are based on fiber-based materials. They have a very large production facility right on the Connecticut River. We have an historic train station that was built in 1875 that's on the National Register. Amtrak line goes right through the community, and we have great highway access from the town center to I-91. What are some of the actions that the town is undertaking in order to try to revitalize the Main Street? It's not just this adoption of the TIF District. The TIF District is really one component of a multifaceted approach. We were looking to relocate the train platform. You'll see in one of the images below, and I'll use my mouse to show you. This star right here is the location of the current train stop. It's essentially a glorified bus shelter. There's absolutely no land around it from which to do any transit-oriented development, and we've been able to convince the state to relocate the platform back into the downtown area near the historic train station. You'll see this image of the historic train station with the group of folks in the white t-shirts with their arms above their head. I thought this was a good promotional piece to try to build community support for restoring that historic asset. We have monthly meetings with property owners and business owners. We've done a master planning study back in 2008. It was completed, and a follow-up TOD study. Chris Ferrero and Stephanie White of Fuss & O'Neill have been absolutely instrumental in our planning efforts in Windsor Locks. We have a farmers market that's been established, this giant mill building that I'll go into more detail, as well as the fact that we're trying to do a complete streets project. So what's the impetus for Windsor Locks' interest in tax increment financing? We have a series of capital projects that we need additional revenue for. Essentially, over the last decade, we've been able to get our Board of Finance and Board of Selectmen and ultimately town meeting to allocate $50,000 to go towards Main Street implementation. $50,000's done a great deal of help with us. We've been able to get additional engineering studies, but that doesn't go a long way when it comes to actual brick and mortar or infrastructure projects. As you can see from this list, and it's not a comprehensive list, this is just things that we're expecting in the near future, a list of $20 million in proposed projects. Some are capital related, some are to work with local property owners. For instance, this facade and signage program that's listed there. We want to try to do things with the canal. We don't have a town green, but we have a green space adjacent to the library, the town hall, and the middle school that we're looking to essentially turn into a town green. So this $20 million list would be funded by a combination of sources: the tax increment financing, as well as allocations potentially from the town general fund on occasion. We'd be always seeking state and federal grants, foundation grants, and obviously private philanthropy. Another impetus for the TIF district is to stimulate private sector investment. I think as many people who are on the webinar probably know that a lot of times it's public money that has to be the upfront seed money to really get the revitalization ball rolling, but the end goal is to improve the market and get more private sector investment. And as Mike alluded to earlier, one way to do that is the use of these credit enhancement agreements. Another word for that is a developer agreement. So as Mike said, it's a legal document. It'll lay out what the terms and conditions of providing assistance to a private sector development would be. It really behooves a municipality, especially the economic development staff, because of the approval processes they're going to go to, is to do your due diligence on the developer, find out what the investment level is going to be, what the job levels are going to be, so that you can make the case going forward. Some credit enhancement agreements could potentially have some clawback provisions or local hiring preferences. All right, so in Windsor Locks and in any community in the state of Connecticut, you can adopt more than one TIF district. You could have several. There's communities in Maine that would have 15 different TIF districts in the community. So we felt that it was important to have a policy that the Board of Selectmen would adopt that would go through the guidelines for adopting any TIF district, as well as the guidelines for improving any credit enhancement agreement. We have an application form when the district is proposed by the private sector. In the instance of the Windsor Locks Downtown District, it was being proposed by the town itself, so there wasn't per se an application, but we went through similar processes. The TIF District Policy charges the Economic and Industrial Development Commission, as well as its staff, to coordinate any TIF district applications. We do have a policy that the districts can be up to 50 years, depending on the various circumstances. We allow credit enhancement agreements up to 10 years and up to 100% of the increased value. That's under the policy. That's actually different than the level that we created in the Downtown Master Plan. The language in the TIF policy was adopted in large part, as well as the application, from examples I found from the state of Maine. All right, a district master plan. We organized the district master plan on the 8 requirements that were required in the enabling legislation. Mike made it quite simple for us to just really lay out the master plan based on these various factors, and it made it very simple to draft the plan. You'll see an image on this slide of the district itself. It goes along State Route 159, incorporates this large mill complex called the Montgomery building. It includes a couple of the strip-related, auto-related retail centers, as well as some other smaller retail and commercial properties. We did not include very much residential aspects to this. Under the legislation, you can always go back and get the districts amended. You'd have to go back to your town meeting in order to do that. The list of property tax ID numbers, that's an easy thing for the tax assessor to come up with. The description of present condition. If you've done any town center master planning, you can most likely pick up information that's right in those previous studies and drop them into your master plan. It's a description of public improvements to be pursued. Again, you know, our district is going to be 20 years. We don't know every project that's going to ultimately be funded through TIF revenue. So we just created a series of projects that we think are going to happen in the short term. And as Mike said, we tried to make it as broad and flexible as possible. In essence, we took the language of the state statute and dropped it right into the master plan, so that It will just not tie the hands of future town officials. We have a description of private sector development. Knowing today those properties that we see redevelopment values, we stated actually in the plan that we would like to reserve the opportunity to do credit enhancement agreements with these various projects. However, we didn't limit ourselves. That was just a list based on today's situation of those projects that we thought were important. I'll go into the financial plan on the next slide. Operation and maintenance plan, we just put it into the document that the Economic and Industrial Development Commission and a TIF advisory board would have cognizance of moving the plan forward. And again, you have to, as part of the statutory requirement, put in the duration of the TIF district, which we had is 20 years. We did include a ninth section in the master plan, and that was this Downtown District Advisory Board. Initially, we were thinking that it would only be the Economic and Industrial Development Commission. We got pushback that there should be representation from various boards and commissions. So ultimately, there'd be a standing advisory board of a member of the Board of Selectmen, one member of the Board of Finance, one member of the Planning and Zoning Commission, of the Economic and Industrial Development Commission, as well as one property owner from the district itself. And then the town planner and the town assessor would also be members, but be non-voting members. All right, the financial plan, once again, these are the criteria that were established in the state enabling legislation itself. So our plan has that incorporated. The cost estimates for improvements, you're going to have some specific estimates that you may have from engineers or architects. If you don't have the specific estimates ready to go and you're ready to adopt this plan, you might just put in an allowance for a certain amount. What is the maximum amount of indebtedness for Windsor Locks? We basically said we do not anticipate taking on any general obligation bonds, but we didn't want to tie our hands, so we reserved the right if the opportunity arises to utilize general obligation bonds. Our expectation is that we're developing a fund, a set-aside fund, to do pay-as-you-go improvements. The sources of anticipated revenues, as I stated earlier, we expect a certain portion of funds for the town center enhancements to come from TIF, but we'd be also looking at state and federal grants as well. The description and terms and conditions of any anticipated agreements, we have, for the credit enhancement agreements, you want to have a policy. We pointed to that policy that no more than 75% of the increased value could be rebated back to the developer. We have estimates of the increased assessed value. I'll go into that a little bit more in the next slide. And then you need to demonstrate what the percentage of the captured value that you expect to go into it. And for the town of Windsor Locks, we chose to have 100% of the increased value go into the account. All right, so this slide itself, as you can see, it's based on 20 years, a year-by-year projection of what we think the increased assessed value and ultimately the captured assessed value. For us, it's one and the same because we're capturing 100%. We have the Montgomery building set out in its own column, and the reason being is because that's the catalytic project. I think that going forward for a lot of communities, if you have a catalytic project, that's a great time to initiate this TIF district process, because then you're going to have that significant new revenue coming into some coffers that you can use for enhancement purposes. The next column, you'll see a remainder of the district captured assessed value. You can see that in year 2017, we don't demonstrate any new revenue. It's going to take a while for this new district to to get some legs, to attract some new development. So we pushed off for a couple of years before we actually demonstrate some new value being created. You'll see in that essentially the third column, it increasing to $2 million, $4 million, up to $12 million. There was no science behind that. That was just numbers that we felt comfortable based on various redevelopment properties in the town center that we'd be able to achieve that amount. The fourth column is the total of Montgomery as well as the remainder of the district, and the last column is a demonstration of what the tax revenue that would be provided into a segregated account that we could utilize for various projects. As you can see at the bottom right, we expect over the course of the 20 years that $9.5 million of new revenue would be generated. I showed you a previous slide that we have $20 million in projects, so obviously this TIF revenue isn't going to cover all of the needs that the municipality has. Actually, I will go back for one point here. One of the issues that we had with the Montgomery project in discussions with the community, it's a $63 million project, and you would think that based on a $63 million project, if you took a 70% assessed value, that it would result in $45 million of rateable. And the bottom line, and you're going to find this in a lot of development projects, is not a one-to-one ratio. There's so much money that needs to go into, say, the conversion of this major mill building, some brownfields improvements, floodplain issues, access issues to the property, that ultimately it doesn't end up resulting in a full rateable. Our assessor came up with an estimate of $12.4 million. We ended up having an outside consultant verify her analysis. They felt that she was actually potentially over projecting a little bit, but still very conservative, and so we went with the assessor's numbers.
Before you move on, Patrick, we do have a quick question about your blue chart there.
Mm-hmm.
So as you're looking 20 years out, are those 20-year out numbers in today's dollars?
Yeah, we kept the mill rate essentially flat, and we did not. It is based on today's current value. We didn't make any additional assumptions.
Thank you.
The TIF district team. The more people you have involved early on, I think it behooves the community. You're going to have a smoother process by bringing people on board right away. In Windsor Locks, our first selectman, Chris Kervick, was just an absolute charismatic champion for Main Street and really pushed this tax increment financing district. He masterfully used a Facebook page called Windsor Locks Moving Forward, which had over 2,000 followers. He posted at least 24 times to communicate to the public about various aspects of the plan. When there was an issue that may have come up, he tackled those issues straight on. Obviously, you got to get through the Board of Selectmen and Board of Finance. In Windsor Locks, there were some turf battles to a certain degree. In the past, when the town has utilized tax abatements, the Board of Finance were the ones to approve that. Under the legislation, it's the Board of Selectmen that have that ability. So that's something that you need to really be cognizant of, is what the local political establishment would be. Our town planner, Jen Rodriguez, was instrumental in getting the Planning and Zoning Commission approval taken care of, and you'll see these other people that are very involved in the process. Some of the things that you got to be cognizant of: you have to have the findings by a local legislative body that the district is areas in need of revitalization. The Board of Selectmen actually can be the ones to assert to that. You need to have your town attorney review it to make sure that the district doesn't violate the charter. You need to ensure that the district does not exceed 10% of the total taxable value of properties in the community. The Windsor Locks Town Center one is like less than 2%. So we still have plenty of other districts that could be created. As Mike alluded to, you do need to get the Zoning and Planning Commission approval. You got to make sure that you go before the Planning and Zoning Commission at least 90 days ahead of time. And we did have an outside consultant review the policy and the district plan.
So we do have a couple of questions, really good ones actually. One was, how much of your plan was developed internally by your town staff as opposed to a hired consultant?
The plan itself for Windsor Locks was primarily drafted by myself, and then it was reviewed by the town planner, the town attorney, as well as the first selectman. The first selectman spent a great deal of time going through revisions and making sure that that it met all the needs that he felt that we could get to the public and get an approval.
And then just a quick clarifying question. So you had mentioned in your particular plan that 75% was going back to the developer. So that other 25% was going back to the town, correct?
That would actually go back into the district itself.
Right, the TIF district.
TIF district, yes.
Okay.
Just a couple things to add on that. This is Mike again. The creation of the plan is going to be really dependent upon the available time for the staff. In certain municipalities, it just might make more sense to bring someone from the outside to do the drafting. And then on the credit enhancement agreement, it's important to remember that most of these credit enhancement agreements, when you enter into one with a developer, we're only talking about the taxes generated on that parcel. So in that case, if 75%, it's only the taxes from that parcel that went back to the developer. Incremental taxes that are generated in other areas of the district, you know, none of that's going to the developer. That would all go to the district.
Mm-hmm.
And then another question we have is, do you know if small towns throughout Connecticut have been able to use TIFs to any great degree? And then Patrick, you had mentioned sort of the area that you guys are looking at was kind of auto-centric strip development. And we have a question about whether large shopping centers can be designated as TIFs, and has this approach been successful?
Well, there's really two aspects. I heard one, can small communities utilize it? The town of Suffield, we're adopting a town center TIF district, should have that in place within the next 3 months. So certainly small communities can do it. And TIF is an ideal tool for some of these older major mall areas that might be struggling.
And then I'm just curious for myself, you know, what are some of the key takeaways that has been your experience? So if you had it all to do over again, what's one thing that you would do differently, or one thing that you would recommend to people setting out on this journey?
Well, that's a good segue to the next slide, okay? And that is the public outreach aspects of it. TIF can be confusing to town officials as well as the general public. That's why it's great to bring on folks like Mike Andreana. The town of Windsor Locks utilized Camoin Associates, an economic development firm out of Saratoga Springs, New York, to help us analyze our plan. You want to have an initial education session early on, and we brought Mike in to meet with Board of Finance and Board of Selectmen and EIDC members. We held 2 public hearings, the first one of which we hadn't properly noticed when we went back and looked at the requirements that it be at least 10 days. We just chose to have that second town public hearing. Based on some of the feedback, we incorporated this Downtown District Advisory Board. We made it so that 50% of any annual tax increment in excess of $1 million would be credited to the general fund. And we actually, I could add a third bullet that TIF could be used to pay for any increased costs for public safety or education as a result of the development within the district. We had a very well-attended town meeting. As I mentioned earlier, we did have a little bit of pushback from some residents, so they petitioned to a referendum, but it ultimately passed overwhelmingly. Some of the things that you want to, in your public outreach, you want to definitely state that the money that's currently coming into town coffers is going to continue to go into town coffers. We're only talking about the increased assessed value. TIF is not an additional new tax. You got to get that point across. Mike has already discussed the but-for argument. It behooves the town to make sure that it's not just a handout to developers, that there's actually a gap in financing. We made sure that the folks in town knew that TIF spending was definitely subject to the same process and constraints as all of the other municipal spending, would have to be approved annually at a town meeting, and that our town zoning and design guidelines are certainly remain operational. This is a photo of the Montgomery Mill Complex. It's over 250,000 square feet. It's laid vacant for the last decade. Thankfully, we got Beacon Communities out of Boston, Massachusetts, that's interested in converting this to 160 units. 40% would be affordable, 60% would be market rate. And as you can see from this slide, the current taxes on that large mill building are only $27,000 a year to the community. After the renovation, we're anticipating $231,000. So the increment is $203,000. We entered a credit enhancement agreement for 10 years. After those 10 years, all of that new revenue is going back into the district for an additional 10 years, and beyond that, it'll go into the general fund. This made complete sense for us to enter into that agreement. As you can see here, this list, I point to John Simone. I always have this concept in my mind is lasagna financing. That it's layers of financing that are needed on these various mill and historic transformations of different projects. As you can see here, they have a first mortgage, a credit enhancement TIF loan. As Mike alluded to earlier, by us giving back 50% of the tax revenue that was incoming to our coffers, they're able to go back out and get an additional loan. They've sought DCD and DOH loan money. It was important to those funding sources that the Town of Windsor Locks had skin in the game. By entering a credit enhancement agreement, we were able to prove that. So that's the important aspect of this slide. So what's next? We're in the process of creating the TIF Advisory Board. Obviously, we're going to need to track and monitor what the money's coming into the district, come up with an annual plan for the expenditure of those funds, and ultimately our goal is to have a vibrant downtown. I'd be happy going into the future to have follow-up conversations with any municipalities and who are trying to establish a district as to what we learned. So feel free to call at any time. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. So I know that we are a little short on time here. We do have a couple of questions. So what I'm going to suggest is that we will take your questions and we can write up a FAQ sheet and post that to the website. As a reminder, this recording will be posted to the website, as will a PDF of the slides, so you can print them out. And in addition, as I said, we can write up a list of the questions that have been asked and those that we didn't get time to answer, and post those on our website within a week.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Our thanks today to Michael Andreana and Patrick McMahon, who are very active members of the Connecticut Main Street Network. We're grateful for your participation in this important webinar, and we thank you again.
Thank you, Kim. I'm just going to add one last housekeeping item. As Christine said, you can find everything on our website, ctmainstreet.org. And as you exit, if you please would complete the evaluation. If by any chance you're listening to this webinar as a recording at some point in the future, you can access the evaluation also on our website, and we would appreciate you taking the time to complete it. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.